Dr. Amy Kruse is going to come up and present. Now, Amy is a mad scientist. She presented at one of our early conferences a couple of years ago in what was termed then as kind of the human dimension, was where we brought her in. At the time, she was a senior person in Cubic that was working on these problems. Since then, she's gone. She's a chief scientific officer at the Platypus Institute. And so a lot of the things that you heard from a very hard science perspective, Greg talked about, what Amy's going to do is talk about that from a perspective of what does that mean about the evolution of humanity, so, and how we interact with these tools. So I really think she's going to add a lot to this conversation.
Thank you, Lee. Thank you. Excellent. I used to work with Greg Kovacs at DARPA, and so I'm used to him insulting neuroscientists. So that was no. What I want to talk to you about today is something that we call Human 2.0. And first of all, I wanted to thank TRADOC, G2, the Army, SRI for inviting me back and for holding this today. It's actually going to be, I think, a fantastic group of people that have been brought together. Today is also International Women's Day. I don't know if you know that, so a shout out to our women mad scientists here in the office, my colleagues in the services, as well as across the DoD and live streaming. Proud to be here today. I wanted to give you a note. So this is a quote: "Man is not going to wait passively for millions of years before evolution offers him a better brain." I want you to think about that, both in the context of my talk, as well as the talks that you're going to hear this afternoon. So, you know, who is that mad scientist? What qualifications do I have? That's a picture of me when I was 2.5. That was my second. So I want to give you a sense of, you know, how mad I've been for a very long time. I have a PhD in neuroscience, so I came out of academia. I became a DARPA program manager. I ran, for 5 years, I was running most of the, what I call non-medical human performance and operational neuroscience programs at DARPA. I'll talk about some of those actually when we talk about some practical things. I then became a vice president of innovation at a small business, which was then acquired by a much larger business, and I became their chief technology officer. So I've really had the experience of transiting through academia, government, small business, large business, and now I'm the chief scientific officer of the Platypus Institute, which is, for all intents and purposes, a kind of beginning of applied neuroscience institute that's actually going to start commercializing some of the things that we're talking about today. And this actually is a reflection of some of the things that Peter talked about this morning about how the industry is working and how things are changing. And so I'll return to that when there's a blank screen, and I'm going to look at you very seriously. So my goals for today are pretty straightforward. I want to communicate the need to upgrade the human and some of the science that will get us there, just some of the science. I want to share my vision of Human 2.0 and discuss examples of how we can enhance performance, very specifically. You know, it's sort of what I want to, feelings I want to engender in you guys today is really an excitement about enhancing human performance, stimulate some curiosity, inquiry, skepticism, you know, really have a debate and a discussion. I think that's one of the great things about the mad scientist environment. And then motivate and inspire. No one is going to be able to do this entire field and all the things that we need to do by themselves. And so I want to create a very collaborative environment. I'm not going to talk about bugs, drugs, or brain zapping today, although I'm a huge fan of all of those. We're going to really, I think that's going to be covered later today. And also, I'm someone who stays in close contact with my colleagues in the DoD, and there are some really interesting conversations that are going on right now as we look at fake news and things like that. There's a big neuroscience and psychology aspect to that. We'll not talk about that today, but happy to have side conversations about that. So, why are we ready for an upgrade? Well, it has been the case, I would say, and this is from Thomas Friedman's new book, and he had a conversation with Astro Teller, who's the guy that runs the Google moonshots, right? They're like sitting in a bar. That's why I made it on the back of a napkin. That turns out maybe it's not a napkin. I don't know. But anyway, they're sitting. These two really smart guys are sitting here having a conversation, right? And the question is like, okay, technology, you know, has been going like this, right? And humans kind of like, you know, just sort of holding steady, maybe getting a little bit better, right? And the problem is not just that humans are not getting that much better, but also that we've consistently relied on technology to be the things that make us better, right? So when technology goes like this, we're kind of like, meep. You know, you actually need to get some cognitive enhancement going to actually start marrying these things up, you know, together. So it's really time now to do with our wetware what we've been doing with our hardware. We need to see this kind of improvement. And I argue, this is my, you know, I've made up a new word. I call it a hypinion. It's a hypothesis and an opinion put together. It's a hypinion. So anyway, my hypinion is that modern neuroscience is really going to be what's going to help us as humans get up that curve. And of course, there will be other things as well, but this is my thesis. This is sort of a question of like, okay, so why do I think this is going to be so amazing, right? So one of the things that changed dramatically, and this is actually something that changed dramatically since I was even in graduate school, is the idea of neuroplasticity. So when I was in graduate school, there was what we had that was called no new neurons, right? Like adults, you know, you kill off your, you know, you're born with more neurons than you need. You go through a process, you know, in your first couple years of life where neurons are pruned down. And supposedly you have all the neurons that you're going to have in adulthood, right? And so this was actually disproven. And now the science has gotten even better where we can track and trace in human brains. Unfortunately, this is something you have to measure posthumously, which is why the process takes so long. But it is the case that new neurons do grow in adult brains. And they actually grow in really important places, like the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory. They grow in places like the striatum, which is responsible for emotion and motor things. And so it's a really important, you know, sort of feature, right, that we can do this. The other thing related to neuroplasticity is that the brain can essentially rewire itself. You don't even necessarily need new neurons, but that we know now in adult brains that we can create new pathways and direct the ways that pathways are created through experience, through things, you know, from a drug perspective, other perspectives, and we're going to talk about sort of rewiring. But I want you to keep in mind right now that the adult brain does change. And, you know, unfortunately, if you think about your smartphone, right, you know, you went through a neuroplasticity event when you started using that machine, right? Some of us may be in an addictive relationship with the machine, but your brain changed and your way of looking for information and the pathways that you seek out information changed. So think about it in terms of that. So when I talk about the power of neuroplasticity, I really mean, and here's where, you know, I was sort of joking about Greg, you know, sort of insulting neuroscientists before. He was talking about a very specific piece, which is the brain-computer interface. I am not talking about measuring people's thoughts. I'm not talking about controlling drones with my brain. I'm not talking about any of those types of, not talking about a motor interface or a thought control interface when I talk about neuroplasticity. I'm actually talking about the ways that you can learn faster, process more information, and take in more information from a visual perspective. We're in a very fortunate place in terms of how the information and the research and everything has come together in neuroscience. We're actually sitting on a gold mine of information about how we can specifically change our brains and how we can actually upgrade our performance. So one of the things that's been so exciting for me as I've transited through the stages of my career is actually not only the burgeoning sort of knowledge that we have, but the ability to start turning those into applications. So I call this Human 2.0, right? So Human 2.0 is really about core capabilities that I think, you know, if you look at the list, right, these are things that we all want and things that neuroscience can actually help us address today, making us more adaptable, heighten our intuition, make us more focused, more creative. We're going to hear about that this afternoon. Increase memory, increase processing, and enhance processing capacity. When I say emerging capabilities, I'm talking about things that are right now, you know, sort of on the edges of what's happening, right? Sensory enhancement. We actually have people who are implanting different types of sensors in both their brains and their bodies to to actually add sensory function. This past year, I was at the DEF CON conference. I was part of the biohacking village. And I would say over 30 or 40% of the people in that audience actually had an implantable in their bodies that gave them an additional sense. I put neuro-enhanced sex up there because I actually think that pleasure and the pleasure centers in the brain and the way that we interact with those is going to be something that will be an enhancement as we move along. Thinking about network brains, you and I actually connected together, brains connected to the IoT, enhanced and expanded emotional capabilities, and uploading and downloading memories. We're already seeing some really interesting work out of DARPA's RAM Replay, a Restorative Active Memories program. So if I think about these things, and then I start thinking about the context of Soldier 2050, right, I really don't see anything on that list. I did change the neuro-enhanced sex to human-machine teaming. So just to make sure we didn't get in any trouble. But there isn't really anything on that list, right, that isn't something that we would want for the battlefield of the future or for Soldier 2050. And I think that's a really important. This is something that Peter addressed earlier. You're starting to see the pull of what the future is like and the pull of what's happening in the commercial industry starting to overlap with where we are, for the operating environment of the future. And so I ask you, and I think, hopefully the answer is yes, I think we are ready for an upgrade. So I'm going to turn the screen blank for a second and tell you that I think one of the challenges in this space is the fact that even though I've been doing this for 15 years. I mean, I've literally been making neuroscience, applied neuroscience aspects for the operating environment. I've been working with the DoD for 15 years. And part of the issue is that there's no real acquisition pull, right, for cognitive technologies, right? This is one of the challenges that we have. And so the Army has actually been leading the way, right, with human dimension, thinking about cognitive dominance and other concepts that have been played around with. The Army Research Lab is making fantastic investments in this space with CAN-CTA. But what we've seen is that challenge of, I've got a huge storehouse of intellectual and academic research. We've got fantastic, burgeoning research in the applied and operational neurosciences, what I call the operational neurosciences, but we don't really have the pull, right, to get those into the space. And so when I talk about what I'm doing now at the Platypus Institute, right, what I have decided personally, even though I continue to work in the DoD and continue to work in the defense space, is that I believe we're going to have to start commercializing some of the technologies in order to get them back into the military, sort of milieu so that they can either be purchased. We talk about the Valley of Death, man. We've been wandering around the Valley of Death for 10 years or something like that. I'm still thirsty. So I want to frame that, and I want to make sure everybody understands, because we need to go about this in a very systematic way. One of the things that I've been thinking about is, from the Human 2.0 perspective, from the cognitive science perspective, the neuroscience perspective, is actually creating a neurotechnology industry, right? Actually going at it like a lead systems integrator, right? And pulling the pieces together. And so that's what I've put together from what we call our Human 2.0 toolkit. So I'm talking about systematically, quantitatively, holistically enabling enhanced and optimized performance. I'm not talking about individual solutions. I'm actually talking about it, going after it like you would a whole system effort. I'm talking about, and from a market perspective, I'm talking about working with elite performers, of course, which the military is definitely a part, right? And so thinking about those populations, thinking about populations for whom enhanced performance is either their mission or what drives their everyday. And that could be executives, that could be general officers, that can be folks who are operating on a daily basis in some very challenging environments. I'm actually a little tired of the word hack, right? I don't want to hack brains and you see, sort of hacking performance and hacking, that seems to me, again, it reflects a very unsystematic way of going about this. I want to go about this systematically. So I want them to rewire in ways that are deliberate, purposeful, and beneficial. And then in order to build the industry like we're talking about, I think it needs to be done in an integrated manner, not in a series of one-off solutions. And this is one of the reasons why I'm calling for a very sort of collaborative tone with this. I'm not saying by any means that I have the whole solution set here, but I think from a framing perspective, as we look towards building Soldier 2050, as we look towards building this environment, we need to think about this. To me, and again, this is my opinion, right? The pieces that go into this are measurements and assessments, identification and metrics, and interventions and improvements, right? So I'm talking specifically about being able to measure specific states, whether that's with physiology, neurophysiology, or other behavioral aspects. When I say identification metrics, actually measuring how close you are to whether it's an expert state or another target state that we're looking at, and then specific interventions and improvements that will address and move the needle, right? Start that rewiring process and moving you towards it. So I've identified a couple things that I think are, for lack of a better term, low-hanging fruit, right? Learning speed, focus, processing speed, resilience, cognitive efficiency. These are things that are well described in the literature that have both measurements, assessments, ways of measuring them, the metrics, and then things that we can do to start this. This is a V1, right? I'm not talking about something that's like completely done. I think we can look at stress reduction, recovery from events, whether those are emotional, physical, or otherwise, enhanced field of view from a visual perspective, faster decision making. So to me, I'm talking about building a toolkit that has each of these components, and each of these components will mature along the way as we build them. And again, a very systems integratory type of approach. So I want to give you an end-to-end example. And this is, I'm free to speak about it because it was my program at DARPA, so if I throw a really long Hail Mary pass to myself and I catch it, I think that constitutes a transition. Like I transition something to myself. So I'm going for this. But this is an example of what I would call end-to-end optimization. So when I was at DARPA, we had a program called Accelerated Learning, right? And accelerated learning, the hypothesis behind the whole program was that experts have expert brain states, right? There's something that makes them masters of what they're doing. Novices or people who are not very good at it will probably not look like those experts. And then if that is the case, that experts look different from novices, then we should be able to use something about neuroscience to actually drive them towards that expert state. We did a ton of research in this program. It's a beautiful set of work. One of the most striking examples was in marksmanship. So in marksmanship, there is an expert brain state that an expert marksman enters like 3 to 5 seconds before the shot, right? Their heart rate decreases, their breathing changes, they have an alpha increase over a particular area of the brain. You get this like theta burst just before the trigger pull. For those of you who have used a weapon or who weapons qualified, you understand the stages, physiological stages that you go through. So it turns out that you can actually train the brain state in novices and get them to move their way to look more like experts. And their improvement, their actual performance improves over 100%. So this is it's a little tiny vertical slice, right? But it shows you that we can measure expert brain states, identify those as like the target, the metric, and then actually use neurofeedback. So what we did was we trained novices to produce that expert brain state. It only took like a week, essentially, for them to learn how to sort of get into the zone and actually create it. And so this is the type of thing that I'm talking about. Now, of course, this is a very specific example, but I wanted to give you something very tangible that I think that you would sort of resonate with to think about. Here's an example from athletics. So part of what we're doing in the commercial space is actually working with athletes and teams, right? And so believe it or not, this is really interesting. So believe it or not, in the US athletics world, professional athletics, the brain is like not even on their radar. This is really interesting to me. I don't know if it's a traditional thing or something else. The UK, Australia, England, Canada, way way ahead in terms of understanding the impact of the brain in high-end performance. But if you look at a basketball team, there are things like court awareness, shooting, game preparation itself that directly map to things that we care about and we can measure in the brain, right? So I can do the same kind of thing. I can do targeted assessments, actually figure out where folks are on these, and then do technology-enabled training to get them, to move them closer, sort of closer up that. So here's an example of why the brain's processing speed matters. I don't have an example of the outcome in a professional basketball team right now, but essentially, the faster you are at tracking three-dimensional things, right, in real time, the better you are at doing assists and passes in a game. That makes sense, right? But it's actually something that you can measure. I can measure processing speed. I can have you track things in real time, three-dimensionally, and see how good you are at it. And then I actually have a mechanism. I have a training program by which you can actually do those and become faster at it. So this is another very tangible example. You can certainly map this to a military example. You can map this to another example of how something like this core capability actually translates into improved performance. And then finally, what I call Humans 2.0, right? Expert teams and synchrony. As part of the same program, the Accelerated Learning Program, we actually looked at expert teams. And it turns out that expert teams also show brain signatures and brain synchronization based on how good they are, right? So you can actually look at an expert team. You can look at a novice team. You can see changes in not only how they are literally, sort of synchronized physiologically and neurophysiologically together, but you can also see it in their communication styles. Novice teams tend to talk more and talk wrong stuff, right? Expert teams tend to use very efficient communications, right? The other thing is when looking at expert teams, they tend to recover faster from errors, right? So novice teams actually, sort of become obsessed with what, kind of what they did wrong. Expert teams go, screwed that up, we did, and they move on. They don't, sort of perseverate on those challenges. Went ahead to show actually work that we had done with our colleagues, or work that our colleagues had done that we've been collaborating with. They went to show this in business school teams. In business school teams, actually, you can see through real-time measures of brain activity emergent leaders in a group. Often, the person who talks the most is not the one that the group sees as the leader. And through neuroscience and neuroscience measures in real time, you can actually see the emergence of the in a group and how people are actually connecting with them and empathizing with them. So I want you to think not only of Human 2.0, Humans 2.0. And then finally, I just wanted to take one moment and talk about an emerging area that I think is relevant to this group, as well as I think will be maybe reflected in some of the talks tomorrow. And so this is what I'm calling Human 2.0 plus centaurs, the idea of a centaur. So the idea of a centaur is, right, so from mythology, right, it was, half man, half beast kind of thing. I always say, I joke with my group, I'm always on the top in the centaur. However it turns out, I'm going to be on the top half. But they first came about looking at chess. So you guys remember when Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov in chess, right? And so this is the moment, when AI, officially came on board and, sort of was better than a human kind of thing. But what most people don't know is that Garry Kasparov then started working with AI chess computers and actually had been working with them before to actually train himself on chess moves. And so what became then was what they call freestyle chess. And so teams of players, novice players, not expert players, actually started to beat computers because humans are good at certain things and computers are good at certain things. And when you actually put them together in this centaur, right, you start to get improved performance. And so what we saw in freestyle chess, you're starting to see now, I would argue, particularly in intelligence analysis, maritime domain awareness is just one example of how humans who have hypotheses, who have smart ideas, who understand context and history and psychology, right, can pair up with computers that actually give them probabilities and hotspots and can analyze thousands and thousands of positions, right, and actually come up with these answers. And so I really want us to think about not just the ways that we've been talking about upgrading humans, right, from a biological or neuroscience perspective, but how with human-machine teaming, we can actually come together and be more powerful than we were before. I was on the Defense Science Board summer study on autonomy, and actually as we looked at autonomy and we got through the first phase where, killer robots are gonna come and, take our school lunch and whatever, whatever else is gonna happen to us when the robots come, right? The number one place that we saw DoD and defense using AI on autonomy was not necessarily in standalone autonomous systems. It was in human-machine teams and human-human-machine teams and looking at that. And so I just wanted to say that, this is also something that we're working on primarily in the finance domain, but actually looking at pairing up humans with these, AI systems, and then adding the piece of actually understanding the state of the individual. We know that people make bad decisions when they're stressed out, right? When they don't have, complete information, when they're, sort of in a bad state. Maybe they're overloaded. Maybe they're lost their attention or focus. And so combining all these pieces together, I think, is one way that we can look at the future Soldier 2050 in that actual operating environment. So I want to leave you with Humans and Humanity 2.0. I think that these are some of the ways that we can look at upgrading humans. I think there are some challenges in the ways that these technologies will be rolled out and adopted by the force. I think we need to look seriously at the commercial industry. Is there a way that we can really start building our own lead systems integrators to pull these pieces together? And sort of bring. I'd like to leave you with a quote from Garry Kasparov himself. Machines that replace physical labor have allowed us to focus more on what makes us human, our minds. Intelligent machines will continue that process, taking over the more menial aspects of cognition and elevating our mental lives toward creativity, curiosity, beauty, and joy. So I just want you to think about not only from a capability perspective, but what may be freed up by actually having us sort of move along this evolutionary timescale and what possibilities there are. So, like Greg, I'm an optimist, always have been. And I just encourage you to think about this, think about the space itself, and I would love to continue the conversation and discussion as we think about Soldier 2050 and bioconvergence. So, thank you very much.
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. Very, very interesting in looking at ways to apply this, certainly in the Army. I've seen a lot of work that's been done, and some folks that have reached out to me that have said, hey, we've got this this capability to increase performance, but they always talk about people who are already high performers.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
They'll say, oh, well, we did this with Colorado Rockies, or we did this with the Army Special Forces. What the challenge we have in the Army is that with active guard and reserve, it's 1 million people.
Yes.
So while it's great to be able to take folks that are already on the right-hand side of that bell curve,
right, and
extend them out even further to the
yes.
right, our challenge is how do we move the entire bell curve to the right?
Yes.
And to do it in a way that's scalable.
Yes.
To the entire Army.
Yes. Thank you for that question. I was actually going to show this slide. So my original program, when I came up with accelerated learning, the program was actually called G-Force, and it was G with a small f, like general fluid intelligence. And my plan was actually to go at moving the whole bell curve. It is absolutely possible to move the whole bell curve. I will be blazingly honest, the only reason we are focusing on elite performers is that's where the money is right now. That is the only reason. You can absolutely move the bell curve, and I'd absolutely love to have that conversation. Okay, who's next?
Hi, wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
You started talking, though, in the beginning about human neurogenesis. I just want to call to your attention and that of the audience that a paper appeared in Nature yesterday calling into question whether neurogenesis occurs in the human brain. Arturo Alvarez-Bulla at UCSF,
Sure.
well-respected scientist, analyzed 59 brains from across a variety of cultures, the largest study ever published. No evidence for neurogenesis in the human brain
Sure.
after age 7. So very different than your work in birds and
Yeah.
primates. I'm
Oh,
sorry,
and
in rodents.
I mean, and thank you for pointing that out. Obviously, it is a big area of debate and question. I guess I want to be very clear that neuroplasticity does not depend on neurogenesis.
Absolutely, I agree with
And
you.
it's just a little bit harder in living humans to do the tractography that's required. And thank you for pointing that out. I think it's still a matter of debate, but absolutely. So.
And it's not impossible to think about inducing neurogenesis
Absolutely.
with drugs further down the line. But at the current time, there's, at least the most recent studies, that calls into question whether there is any evidence for it
Sure.
in the human brain.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Just shout.
Maybe better that way, actually. No, actually, that was a wonderful talk, and it's great to see you still have all the energy.
Yeah, if anybody could follow you, it would be me.
Well, so just for the record, I don't insult neuroscientists nor synthetic biologists. I insult the arrogant ones.
Sure.
And when I meet the non-arrogant ones, I love them. So that's
Right.
all I try to do.
Right.
The question I had, though, was in the curve of human performance improvement. I would posit, or what was it? Hypenion. My favorite word like that is voluntold. My boss says
Exactly.
we like
Yes.
to-
Yes. Very similar.
That the dynamic range in human performance has expanded greatly, and that's not captured in that chart that you showed. Do you agree?
I do think that the dynamic range of performance has expanded, but I don't think we are mode matching with technology in the ways that we can. First of all, I mean, I think it's ill paired. Do you know what I mean? And so I think we have expanded. I agree. I don't think we're well matched with technology the way we are now, and we're certainly not going about our enhancements and improvements in a way that I think is systematic that addresses that.
I think the part of that would be great for a beer conversation is humans are still driving the technology curves. There are smarter and smarter people making that curve go
Yes.
exponential.
Yes.
It's not machine self-driving, so they're
No.
not independent functions.
Yes.
Two more questions. I'm sorry I hit lunch. Amy's here and she's here this afternoon.
I am. I'm going to be here the whole time. I promise.
Andrew and then Robert after that.
So great talk, Amy. Thank you much. When we look forward as computers have gotten better, you know I'm a big fan of enhancing human performance. And
Yes,
I believe
I do.
it. But human-computer teams are no longer better at chess. Computers have been
Sure.
better for about 5 years.
Yeah.
So, but chess is not even
Right.
not
Yeah.
even
Yeah. Yeah.
close to as complex as
It's
the
an
real world.
example problem.
So,
Yeah.
so where do you see the enduring advantage, and where do you think the key upgrade opportunities are for humans? What's the biggest effect size?
What's the biggest effect size?
On like making money, for example.
Yeah, no, I know. I honestly would say there's probably a couple. I would say the biggest effect size would be in handling stress. I would say you can solve that problem. You can solve a lot of problems. And then I would just, as an aside, I would say in terms of focused attention and the ability to absorb information. We've talked about flow in the past, the experience of flow. I think there's a huge effect size to be had with people having sort of optimal experiences, but I don't think you can get people there until you take until you address the stress issue. And sleep, of course. I mean, yes, sir.
Hi, it's a great talk. You didn't talk about the kind of progress that I was hoping you were going to talk about. So, it was interesting that you ended with this quote because he's talking about offloading menial tasks in
Sure.
our cognition so that we can focus on creativity, curiosity, and beauty. And and your human 2.0 just looked like a kind of bigger, faster, stronger warrior,
Sure.
which I'm happy to have. I'm a tanker. I like big, fast, strong
Right,
things.
sure. Me too.
But I'm more interested in your take on the discourse about moral enhancement. So there's this big
sure.
debate in neuroethics about whether or not we need to do some sort of neuroenhancement to get us out of the cognitive biases that we inherited from our evolutionary adaptation,
Yes.
and how that might, if there's that kind of hope for human
Yes.
progress,
Thank
which
you.
would really be bad for the defense industry, but
No,
I think
yeah,
pretty
no,
good
I mean,
for
I
humanity.
will admit I did perhaps tailor to the particular audience. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because it did actually slip off the talking points from when I was talking about hacking, hacking performance or whatever. One of the problems with the way that people go out about hacking performance is you're just working your way around cognitive biases and little, the problems that are already in there. From a neuroscience perspective, I apologize for not addressing it, but absolutely in terms of the moral aspect, we can measure and create things like empathy, right? We can drive ourselves to less biased spaces, and I would love to continue the conversation with you about the ways that individuals are using neuroscience for peace, right? Actually trying to de-bias. We absolutely know that the way that we present information, the way that we convey information, tends to re-enhance the biases and the in-group, out-group sort of things that people already have. And we can absolutely use neuroscience to sort of rewire and re-engineer within that moral conflict itself. So thank you so much for bringing that up. I'm sorry I didn't talk about that today. You can chase me down and I will bend your ear about the ways that we can do that. So thank you so much.
Don't run off.
Okay, all right.
So,
You know me.
though Amy is already was a mad scientist.
Never been
But
proclaimed.
we didn't proclaim her, and we have a couple of individuals that are second-time winners on presenting, and that we have to get them proclamation.
Thank
So
you.
this is so you can actually prove it.
Thank you. That's
I will
because
tell
do
you.
need proof.
I'll tell you, it's a big deal. You can go look at Pete Singer, who's a prolific writer, wrote Ghost Fleet. Go read his bio when he writes. The last sentence, he proclaims that he's an Army mad scientist.
That's right.
You can use it everywhere.
I'm editing my bio today.
That's right. We'd love you to. And here's the
framed,
the frame
suitable for
piece,
framing.
a patch.
Thank
Get
you.
yourself a lab coat.
I have one, actually.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
And here is the challenge coin.
Thank you, my friend.
Outstanding.
Yeah, thank you
And
so
I know
much.
a lot of people want to engage with you
Right.
throughout the rest of the
bet.
conference. And so
Thank you,
make sure
Lee.
you do that.
Thanks
That's
for having me back.
it won't count as one of your 10 people, because effectively I introduced her to you earlier. 1 minute, I'm going to tie a couple of things together. And some of what I say you can completely disagree with, and that's great. First of all, Amy mentioned that she was recently at a DEF CON, and about 20 or 30 or 40% of the people had actually physically enhanced themselves in some way with sensors. There's a whole movement called transhumanism, which is an on-the-edge social movement. And there was a great blog post done by Howard Simpkin, who's in the room, who will actually present tomorrow on ODA 2050. He wrote something on our blog at madsciblog.tradoc.army.mil. And there's a flyer out there with the link on it. But he wrote something called Sine Pari, which is an idea of a recruiter in 2050 that is actually recruiting somebody who has physically enhanced themselves as they're going through this interaction. So this isn't edge science. There are people that are doing it today, and here in the near future, a recruit will come into a recruiting station and want to join the Army, but they would have embedded something in themselves. And we probably ought to think about that as an Army before we're trying to figure it out on the fly, because it will be something that we have to deal with. Secondly, you heard Amy, with a little frustration, talk about her moving her company away from the defense industry and to the commercial world. This is very related to what Peter talked about, a change in the innovation cycle from things developed in the government. Hey, I have toothpaste because it was developed by the astronauts for NASA. Whatever nonsense that is, but that's changed, and she's going to go make money in the commercial world, and we're going to be figuring out in the Army how to take what's being done in the commercial world and apply it to how it fits into the Army. So I thought it was really related to Peter's innovation cycle he laid out. And then lastly, Andrew Hurd, which will present after lunch, is a phenomenal presenter, but he has told me numerous times as his frustration at dealing with the Army on some of this is that he believes there needs to be a program executive office for soldier enhancement.
Stole my fucking closing line.
I did. Well, you told me that a year ago, and I tell people all the time. So Andrew's going to say it again because we're spread all over the place. So you can find the program that's interested in armor or this or that, but there's no unity of purpose in the Army about how we're going to enhance soldiers, how they interact with things, and all that piece. Andrew will explain it in a much better way, but I wanted to tell you that this is something that he's been in our ear as one of our great mad scientists that we need to do as an Army and think about. So that said, if you disagree with what I've said, I'm great to have that conversation with you.